This is lecture 2, and we're talking about shape. And if you recall from the first discussion, the first lecture, shape is an enclosed line. It's a visually perceived two-dimensional area. And so we have two ways of designating shape. Generally speaking, when you go to make a shape, you're going to start with a line. So you're going to create a line that starts and ends at the exact point, which is the position in space. And then we can keep it outlined, or we can actually fill it. This shape is both outlined and filled. This kind of shape will emphasize a two-dimensionality. This is outlined and indicating perhaps no fill, or this one is outlined with fill. And both of these, because of the outline, will emphasize a two-dimensional understanding. So we recognize these as flat planar forms. A shape that is filled or that has forced edges is more understood as three-dimensional. So it is this kind of shape where we start dealing with the illusion of volume. When we deal with shapes, there's varieties of shapes, and it's an interesting thing to break them down into the types of shapes that do exist. And any one design can have a wide variety or types of different shapes going on in it. So the most basic idea would be the geometric shape, and these are shapes that are mathematically precise. They're the kind you work with in geometry, where you have the obtuse and the acute angles, and you've got the circles, and you've got the radius and things like that. Everything is proportioned mathematically and measured. So if we look at this poster, the first thing we notice is that it's a rectangle, and each of the four corners is a 90-degree angle, so this is a geometric shape. And then we have the human sort of silhouette in here, which is actually composed of a variety of squares all stacked up on each other. This is the base unit, and there's one below it, and one below that, and one below that, and one below that. There's two to the side, two to the side, two up, and so forth. So this guy is all composed of squares. As we look at this book cover from von Glitzka, we notice it too has a rectangular shape. It is geometrically shaped. The cover design itself consists of three rectangles. We have the upper rectangle, we have the white rectangle with all the title and everything in it, and we have the bottom rectangle. And then we have the circle here, which is also geometric. So these are geometric shapes. Organic shapes are those that you actually find in nature, or that represent to a great degree that which we find in nature. Organic shapes can be stylized, such as in this Schwab poster. They would also be, if you were taking, just looking at this photograph, the pelican himself is all organic, and then the various parts would be organic. So a feather, a leaf, things like that are all organic shapes. Rectilinear shapes are not geometric, but they have all straight edges, and leads to a wide variety of options. This is from a logo, and we notice that the various angles and so forth don't add up to 360 or 180, and that they're kind of go off in directions as needed. And so this is not mathematically contrived in terms of being exact and measured, but it is rectilinear. And as we look at this motif, we have, yes, a geometric shape in this red triangle, but that's basically the only one. The other triangles are not geometrically formed, so they're rectilinear. Then the blue field is rectilinear but not geometric, and so is the white field. The yellow field, of course, is rectangular, and therefore it is geometric. Curvilinear shapes are those that have curved edges. And so a basic crescent shape would be curvilinear. As we look at the logo here with the two hands, we notice that all of the edges have a curve to them, even if it's a very slight curve. Curvilinear shapes can have points and corners. Here we have geometric shapes. We have a circle on a larger circle on a larger circle. So here we have the geometry, and here we have the curvilinear. In the cartoon panel from Geek and Poke, which is a really cool kind of tech-savvy cartoon blog you might be interested in looking at, Geek and Poke all have curvilinear shapes or forms to them. The talk bubble is a curvilinear shape. Irregular shapes are made up of both curved and straight edges. So as we look at the 2, 3, we have a straight edge into a curved edge. It straightens out. There's a corner. There's another straight. There's another straight. Then we go into a curve and so forth. So this is irregular. And what we have going on in here with the depiction of the linked chain breaking apart, we have irregular shape. We have straight edge, curve, straight edge, curve. And here we have straight and curve and so forth. So an irregular shape combines both straight and curved edges. Accidental shapes happen because something happens. They're the result of a process, and the reason that they're called accidental is because you can't control everything about that shape making. Where a geometric shape is the most controlled type of shape you can make, an accidental shape has parts to it that because of the process by which you're creating the shape, you can't control what's going on. So in the torn paper shapes that are shown here, you can't control exactly how the paper is going to tear, so the subtleties in the edge description are going to be uncontrolled. And when you make brush strokes or certain marks with pencils and graphite sticks and things like that, there is going to be a uncontrolled aspect to how the edges work, how they result, whether the paint or the medium is coming off cleanly, or we've got glitches in it like in a dry brush technique, things like that. If you spill your coffee onto your desktop, the resulting shape that the coffee is making on your desktop is accidental because you spilled the coffee. That was the action or the process, and then there's this resulting splat, and that's uncontrolled. So that would be an accidental shape. So looking at this very well-known icon, what do you see? What kind of shapes are involved in here? Obviously, we've got a geometric circle, and obviously we have another geometric circle. But the white area is a curvilinear shape. It has 2 corner points, but then it has curved edges. So this is made up of geometric and curvilinear shapes. So we look at this logo, we see a lot of accidentalness to it. There's a roughness to the edge, and in the calligraphic brush stroking there's a roughness. So we have accidental shapes going on in here, but then we have geometric shapes. So we look at the 2012 Summer Olympic Games. Again, we have the geometric shapes, but then we have not geometric, but rectilinear. So what do you see going on here? I'll let you think about that for a moment. We have, with the M breaking apart, we have a geometric concept going on here. There is geometry here because there's regularity in those angles. The smaller blue are more rectilinear than geometric because they're not mathematically precise in their angles, but they are straight edges, so they are rectilinear. And then we have this shape, which is because of the negative space, the kind of hand-drawn handwriting type that's happening there. It is a combination shape. It's irregular. It has a bit of rectilinear quality to it, and it has a bit of accidental. And obviously the handwriting type in the T and the V are somewhat accidental because of the roughness of the edge. When we deal with shapes, we deal with shape relationships. And the building up and the creating of those relationships starts giving us a spatial understanding in any design or image. And so here we're just listing the basic definitions of those shape relationships. We have detached, we have relationships that are touching, overlapping, interpenetration or penetration, also known as transparency. So those three different names basically mean the same thing. Shapes that are united, shapes that are subtracted, shapes that intersect, and shapes that divide. So as we look here, these are real simple examples of each. We have in this picture plane a large gray shape and a smaller orange circle. And there's, of course, space between them. And we also recognize size relationships. This is large and this is small. But notice that they are not interacting with each other in any way. They are both sitting in the same design space, in the same picture plane, but they are detached from each other. It's like they're in the same elevator, but they're not talking to each other. Here, now we have a touching relationship. The one shape is addressing the other and vice versa. Both of these understandings emphasize flat space, two-dimensionality. When we get to an overlapping, where one shape overlaps another, we get to a beginning of a three-dimensional understanding, because to overlap, one thing has to be on top of or in front of another. And if something is on top of or in front of something else, or below it or behind it, we automatically have now a spatial depth relationship, because two things cannot occupy the same place at the same time in real space. So overlapping is our first foray into dimensionality, the illusion of volume. Interpenetration is where one shape is transparent, or all shapes can be transparent in that case, but where we achieve transparency because the color of the overlapping shape is affected both by the ground and the shape that it's overlapping. So here we have the orange affected by the black and by the gray. Shapes that unite both disappear into one new shape. So we no longer have the rectilinear form and the geometric form. They are now creating one brand new irregular shape. And it's like marriage, there's a total blend. And so the two shapes that created the new shape disappear and the one new shape emerges. Subtraction is where you take a bite out of something. So we see the influence of the circle into the rectilinear shape, but the circle doesn't exist anymore, but we recognize that it used to. And subtraction is used a lot in logo design and in other things. If you think about a pizza and you divide that pizza into, say, 8 or 12 wedges, if you remove a wedge, you have subtracted from that pizza circle. So if you have that wedge in your hand, what you have is the intersection of the circle and the triangle that is the actual wedge that you cut into. When you cut a pizza into wedges for everybody to eat, you're actually cutting triangles. And so you pull out a triangle with a curved edge. And so that piece that you eat is the intersection of the circle and the triangle. So intersection is where you have two shapes overlapping, and all you have remaining is the overlapped area. It would be like a intersection of two streets coming together. And the point at which the north-south direction overlaps the east-west direction, that's the intersection, and that's what you have left. You get rid of everything else and you just have the intersection, so that's why it's called intersection. And then there's division, which is not really transparency. It's a different issue. Instead of two shapes overlapping to make one shape, you have two shapes overlapping to make more shapes than you originally began with. So with division, we have two options being shown here. We have, of course, the circle, and then obviously it does have an overlapped relationship to the rectilinear shape, but the intersected area is now a different color. And so instead of two shapes like we have here, or one shape like we have here, we have three shapes, 1, 2, 3, and then of course the background shape. And we can basically color those any way we want. And so this last one is this idea, but just with different color assignments. So division gives you more shapes than you actually began with. This is a wallpaper from Veer. Some of you might be familiar with Veer, Veer.com. It's a online stock photo and type site and things like that. And in this you can see that pretty much everything is transparent in relationship. All your typographic forms are transparent on each other, and you can see the kind of spatial effect that penetration or interpenetration is actually yielding. And then we have an overlap of the logo. The logo appears to be sitting on top of the field of transparent letter forms. As we look at this painting, we notice first of all the picket fence, and it is overlapping the facade of the house, and the house is overlapping the sky. So we have the overlapping relationship that gives us a spatial understanding. This is closer and in front, this is kind of mid-ground, and then the sky would be background. But notice what's going on with the picket fence. We don't see all the pickets. Basically, we see some of the, the space between some of the slats, but we don't see every individual picket rendered out. This is union or united. So all the different shapes are blended into each other, and this actually forms one new shape. As we look at the logo on the top, we definitely have a transparency effect. Where the two heads meet, the blue and the yellow-orange meet, we get kind of this tan ochre color going on. And we can still see the outline of the yellow-orange head and the outline of the blue head. Then we have the two eyes, and they're most likely seen as being subtracted. And because they are the color of the surrounding area, we will see these as subtracted geometric shapes in the irregular shape. The leaf shape that's resulting, by the way, is a stylized organic shape. Notice the transparency effect is repeated in here. Looking here, this is not transparency, it's division. We have this shape and we have this shape, and the relationship of the two is actually yielding us three shapes. We have the darker gray, the lighter gray, and the black. The circles are geometric and they are detached from the irregular shapes, pardon me. And then the apple will be seen as sitting on top of or overlapping. Second option would be that this is negative space, negative shape, and so it would be a void. But generally, because of how we normally associate the little icons on shirts and things like that, we will see the apple as overlapping the black shape rather than subtracting from it. So in this is actually a student exercise from a different class dealing with the same thing, but we can see overlap, we can see detachment. The circle is detached from everything, but it's overlapping the large pink area. This is being read as subtraction because it's the same color as the black. This is being understood as subtraction. This is division, the triangle over the circle, and then the resulting intersection is now black. It's a different color, so it's not an orange, which if this were yellow and this were pink, we'd have kind of a peachy color here. This is black, so this is division, so it's not transparency. This is also division. This is division. This is overlap. Shape relationships will relate you to the Pathfinder tool in Adobe Illustrator. If you are familiar with Illustrator at all and you've ever had to take two shapes and make them one shape, hopefully you've used the Pathfinder. And so you select both shapes and then find the Pathfinder and click on this, and then you expand it and you have one brand new shape. So the Pathfinder palette in Illustrator actually relies on all of these different issues to give you all these different options and possibilities. So you see we have the division, and we have the overlapping, we have transparency, we have another kind of division using outline shapes, we have the union creating one new shape, and so forth. So they're all here, and this is intersection. They're all here. When we have shape, as I mentioned before, we have spatial understanding starting to form, and design is about space. You always design in a predetermined space. So if you're designing for a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, that's a different space understanding than a 3 by 4 aspect ratio. So analog TV versus high def TV, different aspect ratios. And you try to put analog space into high def space, and you have to really expand it, and all your baseball players look like they're 300 pounds. That's just wrong. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when you have a particular space to design in, that you always design for that space. You don't start out designing for a square with the intention that it's going to end up in a rectangle. If you're designing a rectangular space, start with the rectangle. So within space and as determined by shape, you are going to have positive space and negative space, and also positive shape and negative shape. Anything that's positive is considered occupied. So a positive space is that which is taken up by something. Negative space is basically the surround, or the unoccupied space. We see positive shape as figure. We understand that as the object or the form, and then the negative space or the shape as the background. So there's always a figure ground understanding. That is an automatic perception in our human sensibility. We will automatically look for and recognize and deal with figure ground relationships. So this is the logo for the Art Directors Club, and if you're familiar with Albrecht Dürer's signature logo from the Renaissance time, you'll recognize where this is inspired from. It also has a little bit of arts and crafts sensibility to it. But the Art Directors Club is one of the older professional organizations in the design field. And their logo is interesting to look at it because it has positive space and positive shape and negative shape. So obviously we see the figure of the black letter forms on the white surround or the white ground. So we have an automatic figure ground perception. And it's very easy to see because it's using the darkest color and the lightest color, and so we perceive this very quickly. Everything around the black letter forms is negative space. All of this is negative space. Positive space is the part of the design area or the design field, the picture plane, that's taken up by the positive form or the figure. And that will always have a shape. So positive space and positive shape are somewhat interchangeable in understanding. A shape is a perceived thing that is occupying space. It's a positive thing, it's a figure, and therefore it's positive space. Negative shape and negative space are a little bit different from each other. I've already pointed out that everything here is negative space. Negative shape is negative space that has defined, easily perceived boundaries, like inside the D. That negative shape, that kind of half circle D shape, that white shape, we can actually pull out and look at separately. It's entirely surrounded by positive form. This irregular shape inside the A, between the D and the crossbar on the A, is also a negative shape. It is entirely surrounded by positive form. Basically, it's a void, and this is a void. This is not a void. The negative space, the surrounding area, comes into the opening. So this is negative shape, negative space. This is negative shape, this is negative shape, this is negative space, this is negative space. So there's a different definition between negative space and negative shape, but positive shape and space are the same. Why is negative space important? Negative space we also know as white space in a lot of design. It's important. Design is made up of not just the positive form, but the surrounding negative space. As we look at the FedEx logo, which should be very familiar to you, we have obviously negative space, and we have positive form delineated by filled shapes, letter form shapes, and two different colors. So we get the one word versus the other, and they relate together. Inside the D we have a negative shape. Inside the E, because it's kind of touching the D, that's a negative shape. This is negative space, this is negative space. This inside the E right here is a negative shape. Now look at the space between the E and the X. There's an arrow there. That is negative shape, and it is specifically and deliberately contrived by the designer. He meant to do that. That's not an accident. He looked at the E, he looked at the X, he brought them together, and he adjusted the X height of the X so that its relationship to the E would make that arrow. Notice that the vertical distance of the mid-bar on the E is a little longer vertically than the bar on the F. So he made the adjustment here to make this into a regular arrow. And by the way, that is a geometric shape. We have a geometric triangle combined with a rectangle, and so that is a combined geometric shape. So if you've never noticed that before, you will never not notice it from here on. But that is a deliberate thing. And so negative shape can become extremely important in a design. We'll look at these logos again. We have positive shape, positive shape, positive shape, but notice that this is actually the negative of the A, but the A is negative space because it joins with the surround. This is a negative shape, negative space, the A itself is negative space. The H has been joined to the negative space around the A to create a new shape, so we have a union going on here. The A is subtracting from the H and the P. This is created by division. And the same sensibilities are happening here. Talking about negative and positive, we need to launch further into the idea of figure-ground. And figure-ground relationship is probably the most important understanding in our visual, perceptual capability as human beings. We can't deal with anything until we deal with figure-ground. When we look at something, figure-ground is an automatic perception. So as we look at this photograph, we have the man with the hat, and then we have a gray surround. So the man with the hat, with all of his suiting and all the forms, the tie and the collar and the hat and so forth, that's figure, and then the gray surround is the ground. Looking at the image on the right, we've basically simplified that into the black figure against or in front of the gray ground. We will understand this is figure and positive shape. This will be negative space. Notice, though, that it is in a rectangular frame of reference, and so we can actually separate the gray shape from the black shape. We have in this image two shapes. So the entire design or the entire image is comprised of two shapes on the right. It is not one shape. When we deal with design, we deal with everything that's inside that frame of reference or that boundary fence. Everything is part of the design. And so figure ground, the ground is as much part of the design and has a role that is as important and substantial as the figure in any design, in any photograph, in any film, in any painting. Figure-ground relationship is an automatic perception. You cannot not see figure-ground relationship. It's a perceived relationship, but you cannot not perceive it. In our understanding, figure will always sit on top of ground, and therefore, as mentioned before, we have a spatial relationship in front of and behind, on top of and underneath. Figure ground helps us to understand what it is we're seeing, to apply meaning. The ground has its own shape. That was already mentioned in the previous slide. An important thing to note is that we will understand only one figure-ground relationship at a time. If there's several in a design, we'll go from one to the other, or they'll flip-flop. So if we are looking at the bottom photograph, we will see the figures of the man and boy, and they're standing on the bank of the Mississippi, and there's the far levee, and there's the river, and there's the sky with the cloud in it. So if we're looking at him, we won't be looking at him. If we're looking at both of him together, we won't be looking at the rest. We'll understand the boy and the man as figures against the ground. If we're taking all the bottom area, the figures on the bank with the river and the far levee, then the sky becomes ground. If we're looking at the cloud, the unclouded area of the sky becomes the ground. So the cloud will be figure, the rest of it's ground. So there are multiple figure ground understandings going on in this image. And that happens in your visual field all the time. Like when you're driving and you're looking straight in front of you at the car in front of you, that's a figure ground relationship. If you're looking 2 cars ahead of you, which is usually a good idea if you're driving on the freeway, you're looking at the second car ahead of you, that's the figure, and everything else becomes ground. If you're checking over your right shoulder to make sure you're not going to bump into somebody when you're changing lanes, you have a different figure ground perception. Figure ground is best understood when you can actually discern the figure from the ground. And so the ability to recognize or perceive edges becomes very important. Now, not everything has a real strong edge ground or edge recognition understanding, and that's okay. Just understand that where we perceive figure ground relationship very distinctly, we will see the figure very quickly. When we lose that distinction, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just it takes us longer to recognize what's going on. So if we look at the poster on the left of Louis, we could take an X-Acto blade or scissors and cut him out entirely of the ground. And every edge here is distinct from the background, whether the background is the white or the gray or what he's sitting on, or over here. So he is easily recognized all the way around and very well separated from the background visually. When we look at Kathy Kollwitz, and this is the artist who drew the thinking guy that we looked at in the first lecture, where we were talking about lost contour and found contour and things like that. This photograph of her is using that same concept. We have a very strong edge recognition here on the side of her face, but then notice how because of the lighting, the shadow on the neck actually allows the neck to be barely discernible from the background. Then the shoulder comes out a little bit, then we totally lose the shoulder into the wrist area. We lose the back of her head into the ground. So we don't have figure ground edge recognition very distinctly in a lot of this photograph. but our head, our mind, will fill in the gaps. That's an important thing to understand because we can use that as designers. Another thing about edge recognition is we can create spatial layering. So if we look at this textile design, we have the black forms very distinct off the ground. And if we're looking at the black forms, the yellow-green forms and the blue forms merge with the white forms, and that all becomes ground. If we're looking at the blue and the yellow-green forms, then the white becomes ground, and the blue and the yellow-green forms actually join with the black forms to become figure. But look at how the black forms seem closer to us, and then there seems to be some depth when we get to the yellow-green and the blue flowers. And so the blue flowers and the yellow-green flowers are sitting kind of side by side each other. Notice the touching relationship as opposed to overlapping relationships, which helps the spatial understanding. They're sitting side by side of each other on the same plane. And then we have the white ground. So we have basically three different spatial understandings based on the ability of the eye to perceive the figure-ground relationship. We will see the black on the white first because that's the strongest difference between lightness and darkness. Then the more subtle, the tinted colors are less distinct from the white because they have white in them, and so they're harder to see. We'll see them, but not as quickly as the black, so that helps give us that spatial plane. We have a foreground plane of black, we have a middle ground plane of the blue and the yellow-green, and then we have a background plane of the white. Edge recognition is not a matter of chromatic change, different colors. It's a matter of lightness and darkness. And so in this Alphonse Mucha poster from Art Nouveau period, we notice the image on the left. We have the lady with the red hair, and we have the kind of blue-gray designed motif that's kind of surrounding, and the hair actually merges into the motif and echoes. There's a lot of implied line here, so you can kind of look around, you know, at all of that. So she's overlapping this, and this is overlapping this, and you know, there's a whole bunch of neat stuff going on in here, and spatial arrangements being played around with because of what the shape relationships are doing. But notice how when we translate this into just a grayscale image without retouching, by the way, how the hair and parts of that crescent actually merge, and it is very difficult to distinguish the hair shapes from the decorative shapes in that crescent. So we lose a lot of the chromatic detail. So our ability to recognize figure ground is a matter of lightness or darkness, not a matter of chroma, not a matter of different colors. And that's really important to understand. Figure ground again gives us spatial planes. We have the swatch, the words in the front, the ladies behind. Then we have the skiers kind of on the same plane as the background motif, and the background motif seems to come forward and actually merge with the woman, her shoulders and things like that. So there's a lot of integration of spatial planes because of shape relationships. We're still dealing with a strong figure ground recognition, but if we're looking at swatch, we're not looking at the woman. If we're looking at any of the skiers, we're not looking at the watch or the woman or the word swatch. So figure ground gives us spatial understanding. It gives us the ability to look at something, recognize it, and give it meaning, and so forth. In this Rembrandt, spatial planes give us the understanding. We've got a tree here in the foreground. The middle ground is where the actual action is taking place. We've got the figure over here, and we've got the figure here, and notice that the lighter area is pulling our eye right into mid-ground. The tree is overlapping the mid-ground, and the mid-ground is overlapping the background. And so that gives us 3 or 4 different planes: a foreground plane, a mid-ground plane, a background plane, and in-between spatial planes. And remember from our first discussion that a plane is a two-dimensional area. We look at this photograph. There is some spatial depth because of linear perspective in the fence. And this is a lot larger than this tree, so we see this tree is further away. But notice what's happening with the fence here. The fence is actually looking flat, and its relationship with the ground, literally and figuratively, behind the tree, there's a merging of the two. And the textural qualities are similar, although they're different colors. If you translated this photograph into black and white, you'd lose a lot of edge recognition, and this would become flat. This looks flat against the tree, but the tree's behind it, so we have an overlapped relationship. But where figure and ground start to merge, we start really emphasizing the two-dimensionality. So the bottom part of this photograph looks flatter than the top part. We don't get the depth that we have in the top part. Figure ground perceptions. Looking at the cue, obviously it's a black form on a white ground, and we have a negative shape in the middle of it. We put that on a yellow-orange ground here, and we still recognize the cue, but notice it's not as sharp, it's not as distinct as the cue on the white ground, because the yellow ground is actually darker than the white ground and closer, and there's less difference between the black and the yellow than there is between the black and the white. So this is the most clear understanding of the shape against the ground. This one takes us a bit longer to understand. When we change the color of the cue so that its degree of darkness is the same as the ground that it's sitting on, this becomes a lot harder to see. If you squint your eye, you will not see the edges real easily. They will kind of blur in your vision, in your perception. That's what happens when things are the same degree of lightness or darkness but different colors. Here, with the distinct outline, we still recognize the cue. We're going to see this is a negative shape and the cue is a positive shape against the ground. So this is an outlined, flat, two-dimensionally emphasized shape. We beef up the outline, it just gets stronger. The figure-ground relationship gets stronger, but it's still two dimensions. If we change the fill color on the cue, then there's no question that the cue part is the positive shape and this is negative. So we have a stronger figure ground perception here in spite of the outlined shape. Here with the white, we're still seeing the white now as figure and the yellow still remains ground. If we start expanding the cue so that it starts breaking the boundaries of that picture plane, we still are recognizing the cue because we already know what it is, and so we're going to understand the cue as positive against a yellow background. So we haven't lost the meaning of the cue. But what's really visually happening here is we've got 1, 2, 3 yellow shapes surrounding negative space. And we're just recognizing what the negative is rather than the positive shape. And so here I pulled apart the 3 shapes so you can see that there is this shape and this shape and this shape all embodied in this. And then the cue, of course, becomes harder to see because the shapes are not relating to each other so as to give us the meaning. The meaning is starting to break up. There's a psychology to figure ground understanding, and we can use that psychology to our advantage in design, so it's important to understand what's going on. When there is a real clear, well understood figure ground relationship, that is considered stable. We get it, we know what to do with it. Figure ground relationships can be reversed. So like in the stripe pattern, we could read this as black stripes on a white ground, or we could read it as white stripes on a black ground. Either way, there is still a figure ground relationship, and so there's still a degree of stability in it. We could read it one way or the other way, but in each case, no matter which way we're reading it, It is a figure-ground relationship, one or the other. Sometimes we'll come across an ambiguity in terms of what is figure and what is ground, and that will happen in a case such as this where we cannot distinguish which is figure and which is ground. We could read this as white on black, and we'll try to do that, or we'll read it as black on white, or gray, or whatever this is, and we'll do that. But there's an ambiguity here, and we're not going to force ourselves to see it one way or the other. We're going to, okay, I'll accept this as ambiguous, and that's okay. And we will tend to actually put this kind of thing into the background because there's no figure ground perception that is easily dealt with, either constant or reversible. This kind of thing becomes interesting to look at it, but then it becomes background. Figure ground reversal it's often portrayed this way, and so we've seen this on websites, we've seen it in books, optical illusions and things like that. You'll either see the goblet, that's the figure on the black ground, or you're going to see the two people facing each other at close quarters talking to each other, and they're black on a white ground. Now you're not going to see the goblet and the people at the same time. You will see one or the other. So you'll either be seeing white on black or black on white. So you see one figure ground relationship at a time, but you can flip-flop it. It's a reversal. Escher, very well known for figure ground reversals, and he created a lot of patterning that utilized this optical understanding. So here we have the birds flying to the right, and then the negative, the birds start becoming negative shape, and then turns into negative space, and we have fish swimming to the right. In the Kandinsky, we've got two wrestlers, and that's using a figure ground reversal. And then another Escher pattern with birds and fish. This logo uses a figure ground reversal. It's a WM, those are the two initials. And so we see the white W on the M, or we see the black M on the white W. We'll see the whole thing together, but as we pick apart what is figure and what is ground, we will see either the W on the M or the M on the W. We won't see both at the same time. So when we have that reversal, that ambiguity, we start pulling back, and the entirety of the design becomes the important thing. In other words, it relegates to seeing the whole thing together. It becomes background, so to speak. And the same thing is happening in each of the four ambiguous compositions on the right-hand side. What is figure and what is ground is kind of up in the air. And one of the things that helps this is that there's about equal distribution of black and white within each of those four designs, and even in the logo on the left. Where you start having more of one color, like if you have more black on white, the white will start being perceived as figure. What you have less of will actually start feeling like it's being surrounded. But if there is a 50-50 proportion in color distribution, or an equal proportion if you have more than two colors, you're going to start seeing ambiguity. You're going to start seeing the whole thing as ambiguous. So we look at the S and its iterations here. Obviously this is a black S on a red ground, very easy to see. We modify the design a little bit and squeeze it in. We still recognize the S as figure and the red ground, and then what we're starting to perceive is a black framework that is sort of helping the S out and helping to support it. Notice that in each instance the red ground is shape, especially here. Here it's basically negative space. Here we've turned the red ground into negative shape. And we've taken each one of these red shapes and combined them together on a black ground. So this is now reading figure against ground. But we recognize this shape here, and this shape is here, and this shape is this one, and this shape is this one, and so forth. So we've taken the negative shapes here and put them as positive figure here on a black ground. Taking those same shapes on the black ground and rearranging them can give us a different illusion of figure and ground. So now we're seeing a black figure on a red ground because of how those red shapes are now distributed. And remember, those red shapes are these same shapes. So they're negative here, they're positive here, they're now perceived as negative again. But we're still reading a strong figure ground perception, black figure on red ground. What do we see when we get here? Those negative shapes, those red shapes, are now redistributed equally with the black ground, and so what is figure and what is ground is ambiguous. So it becomes two-dimensionally emphasized. Another Vasarely, figure-ground relationships. Your standard checkerboard is an ambiguity. Within the figure-ground understanding, as we look at the whole thing, what is figure and what is ground? Because in some parts the circles are figures, in some parts the squares are figures, in some parts the kind of surrounding outline, the different colors become figures. So there's ambiguity, there's different figure-ground understandings throughout this piece. And here it's all the same, and it's basically ambiguous. Is this black on red, or is this red on black? Given the same design structure, changing out the way figure-ground understanding works, you can have a variety of patterns that are based on the same theme. So here these African designs are doing just that. On the left, we have white figure on black ground, and here what was ground in here is now more of a figurative understanding. And because of the color distribution, this is a little bit more ambiguous than this is in terms of spatial understanding. But you can obviously see the relationship between the two designs and then the variation that this is on that. Figure ground and meaning. If you're aware of logo design and things like that, you should be aware of a lot of figure ground reversals and negative shapes and things like that. So we look at the logo that's there on the left, the DM. The negative shape is now cleverly conformed into a gardening trowel, and that would be appropriate because this is a logo for a landscape designer, whose initials, by the way, are DM. And over here we have 4 irregular shapes, but these are negative shapes, but the actual negative shape, negative space, reads the word tie. And as we look at this, we have optical illusion. If you can see the word illusion, optical becomes negative space. If you're reading the word optical, then the image, the illustration of the landscape becomes negative. But this is a reversal. And it is an optical illusion, which is kind of fun. Figure ground ambiguity is useful in a lot of ways. We use it a lot to bring textural effects into a background in a room. Like you walk into a room, the last thing you want to focus on is busy wallpaper if the room is wallpapered. So a figure ground pattern and ambiguous relationship in that wallpaper design will relegate that to a background setting. It'll set the stage, but it will not be the hero of the room, which is probably a good thing. Also, in current design, you'll see a lot of background patterning and ornament going on, and then things placed on that. And so you want that background to be a supporting role, not the hero of the designs. Ambiguity is useful, and at the same time it can be disconcerting. If we look at the image on the left, it's basically kind of a splattering of black and white value pattern, and it's hard to make out what's going on there. It's also upside down. If you look at the patterning on the right, and you look closely enough, there is a figure that starts to emerge, and you can see a Dalmatian, who is black and white, sniffing the ground. Here's his head, the collar, the shoulder, the rear end, and the two legs. And he's actually in sunlight, but there's a lot of cast shadows from trees. And there's another shadow here that's a little more dense. So, but he's still not easy to read, because he blends with his surroundings. And so ambiguity is useful when you want to blend with your surroundings. We find it in nature. Certain insects, certain animals will change to conform to their surroundings, what they're sitting on. And we also like it to keep out of sight, basically. And so the camouflage patterns that our military wears are meant to obscure the figure recognition, the figure ground recognition. So basically you will look past the figure looking for other figure ground relationships. And this was actually sent to me by somebody, and because it is a great example of looking past the obvious, which is camouflaged, to the first figure ground understanding, which is the sofa itself. But the second read is that there is a Marine lying on that sofa face down and blending in with the background pattern, because his BDUs, his camouflage pattern, is making him blend and hard to perceive against the patterning of the sofa. So it's just kind of a fun thing to look at, but that it's a very, people study camouflage patterns and create things where you're going to not notice the figure when it's there. It's basically to hide or to obscure the figure. So, final analysis. What do you see? What kind of shape relationships do you see going on here? First of all, these are mostly geometric shapes, and there's a lot of division. There's a little bit of transparency effects, but there is a lot of division as well. And not a whole lot of overlap understanding here, really. There's a few areas where shapes seem to overlap other shapes, but mostly it's a side-by-side relationship, and so this entire painting is basically two-dimensionally inclined. Notice the NBC logo, and the peacock body is actually a negative shape. The S is subtracting from the U and the A, but the U and the A have been united with the negative space around the S to form new shapes, so that the S can actually sit there and do its thing. And in the very famous Apple logo, we notice that there is subtraction, and there's also detachment. So what do you see here? This is a set of chairs, and it's a photograph that was taken of chairs in a room, and all the negative space has been colored with chromatic color, and all the positive forms have been blended into one shape. So we have union of all those different shapes by virtue of the fact that they're all the same color, and they're all pretty dark. They're not quite black, because we have one black shape here, but everything, it's a really dark kind of charcoal gray, but they all unify into one shape, and then the negative shape has been colored and made positive by the application of the chromatic color.